Hi there, welcome back. Now, having talked about the pricing strategy and also how to apply them in making pricing decision, it's then important to then also now speaks to how you can determine the price of your product, the elements of costs precisely. And of course, we also talk about other factors we should also consider beyond the quantitative factor, which is the price, in determining the price of a product. So, cost of production, of course, cost of production is usually the cost you incurred in producing a particular good or rendering a service. And of course, it's subdivided into three. Three things makes up the cost of production. Number one is your material cost. That is the cost you incur in buying the material needed to produce. Imagine a small business owner in the agricultural industry into planting, for instance. The costs of seeds in farming is a good example of material cost. The next is labor cost. The wages, for instance, that you pay to your staff, to people who work for you on the project constitutes your labor costs. Then the next is your expenses. Every other cost that you incur, of course, for the running of the business or for the purpose of making sure that you deliver on that job constitutes your expenses. Example, transportation costs. Having understood the quantitative aspects of pricing, then you then ask yourself, what are the other factors that you need to consider in making pricing decision beyond the cost of production? Number one is the market demand and supply. Very, very important. The pricing of a product is determined by the interplay of the forces of demand and supply, right? It has been posited that other things being equal, when the demand for a product is higher, is more than the supply, the price of that product tends to go up. And of course, when demand is lower than the supply, meaning there is a lot of supply but lesser demand to absorb the supply, that way the price of the product tends to reduce, other things being equal. So when you want to make pricing decision, you need to consider the demand and supply for your skill in that industry. If it is a skill that is readily available in the industry, then of course the price, you may want to determine a price that is relatively lower. If it is a skill that is very rare to find in that industry, of course you may determine to increase your price. So it's important to consider the demand and supply in that market. The next is competitor pricing. What price or how much are your competitor also selling that same product you are selling? Or how much are your competitor also charging for that same service you are rendering? So it's important to consider competitors' pricing, like we mentioned previously, so that you are able to also benchmark what you are charging, and so that you're able to also manage your client base well, and you don't risk losing some of your clients to your competitors. So it's important to also consider that. The next thing you consider is the value proposition. What value is that service proposing? So if the value you are proposing is relatively higher, of course, you may consider a price that is also a bit higher, such that that price can also provide for the premium. That's the value addition that that product will also be bringing to the users of a product. The next is your target audience. You want to consider also your target audience in also determining pricing. For instance, you must be able to segment your markets, right? Maybe look at the market demographics. You maybe streamline them by income, by age, and all of that. For instance, you may want to sell a product at a higher price in a location where you have middle class income earners and high net worth individuals, compared to in a location where you have people who earn within the minimum wage range. So it's important to consider your audience, your market, your customer is important. Then you are able to also price your product appropriately. That is a term in economics they call price discrimination, where you tend to sell a product at a price different from the price you sell the same product in another location. So it's important to consider the audience. You also consider the skill level and expertise. What skill is needed to be able to carry out that job or deliver that job successfully? It also helps you to determine the costs you'll be incurring on producing that good or rendering that service, and of course trickle down to the price you'll be charging. Then it's also important to also consider the time and effort required, the resources in terms of time that is also required to deliver on that job. You also need to consider that when you are determining pricing decision. Some job might take relatively longer time than the other. So you may want to also factor that into the price you will charge for your product. The next is the economic condition. Yes, economic condition is also important. For instance, the impact of inflation, right, on the service you render. For instance, the raw materials you may need, inflation might have affected them and the price might have gone up. In that case, you also want to consider that, because inflation is an economic condition, right, that affects the business climate in whatever country you operate. So you may want to consider the economic condition like inflation, like exchange rates, amongst other things. The next is, of course, your brand positioning as well. You want to consider your brand as well. How positioned is your brand in the market, right? It's important to also consider that in determining the price. You don't want to decide on a price that will put the brand you have built over time in jeopardy. The next is, of course, is the regulatory and tax requirement. It's also something you need to consider, right? There are some jurisdictions where certain goods or certain service are vatable, right? You must pay VAT on those goods. So you may also want to factor that into determining the cost of production and, of course, by extension, the price of your products. Taxation will also be discussed extensively in subsequent module. Then, of course, the delivery channel and convenience is also something you also want to consider in making pricing decision. How are you able to deliver your product? Are you able to deliver it in a fast and reliable manner? And what is the costs also associated with whatever method you have chosen to deliver the product? You also want to consider that. Then we move to the practical example of how to calculate the price of a product. Then we just take this question very quickly. Chi Agro business grows wheat on a 100-acre farm. The material cost, that's the purchase of seed. We're using an example of an MSME in the agricultural sector. The material, that's the purchase of seed, is 100,000 naira, fertilizers 50,000 naira, wages to laborer 30,000 naira, rent of tractor 15,000 naira, payment for irrigation services 20,000 naira, miscellaneous expenses 10,000 naira. Then Chi Agro business usually produce at a cost plus markup of 10%. That means they charge their profit at 10% of their cost of production. Then Chi Agro business plan to harvest and sell 300 bags of wheat. Now, what is the ask here? Determine the cost of production, the profit, and the selling price. We're just trying to implement what we have learned on how to calculate cost of production and, importantly, price. So the solution is projected. You have the cost of material, which is the purchase of seed 100,000, fertilizers 50,000, labor cost, which is wages to laborer 30,000, payment for irrigation service 15,000, making a total of 45,000. Then expenses, those are miscellaneous expenses. Other indirect costs is 10,000 naira. So if you add everything together, 10,000 plus 45,000 plus 150,000, the cost of production then comes to 205,000. Because Chi Agro is to make 10% on cost as profit, then 10% of 205,000 is 20,500, bringing the selling price to 225,500 naira. So Chi Agro Limited will be charging 225,500 naira for this project. Bear in mind, after determining the cost and also adding the profits. I hope you have been able to learn how to determine the price for your product, be you an MSME, a freelancer, or a gig worker. Thank you very much.